باب المدينة وحامي نبينا، باب المدينة وحامي نبينا. علي 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 منهج، علي تلهج باسمك املاك السماء، علي صولة وعلي جولة، علي بتار ودماء، علي سجدة على خده للعلي دمعة همة، علي غيرة وعلي غيرة من كفول فاطمة.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قد أفلح من زكاها وقد خاب من دساها. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Shams, Surah 91, ayahs 9 and 10, that the one who has succeeded is the one who purifies the soul, and the one who has failed is the one who instills the soul with corruption. Assalamu alaikum to our respected scholars, our elders, our sisters, and our brothers in Islam. This morning I'm speaking to you about Ensaan and Kamil, the perfect human. And I'm looking at it in a three-part series, beginning this morning by looking at the origins of the public school model and the needs of the Muslims. But let's put this into context, because this morning we're addressing the needs of the 21st century and how we as the followers of the Ahlul Bayt can take the example of Imam Ali alayhi salam and put it into practice. He is our representative as a perfect human. And this morning we've looked at how to engage the American society at large, which is a priority. We really should have a presence always with our neighbors, with others in other organizations, within our work and our school environments. We're going to look now at education and its role in developing the human being to become really a true representative of this religion on this earth. And that's one of the mechanisms in which we can help develop Islam more solidly within the community. We're going to look a little bit later at developing the youth with Sheikh Hildi and looking at the role of the youth and really bringing this religion forward. And then, inshallah, Dr. Sayyid Amar Naqshwani is going to be speaking about Hujr ibn Adid, a victim of terrorism. And when we look at that topic, we have to wonder, how is it that humanity can get so low and so brutal and heartless that they would be willing to desecrate a grave and remove a body and do other horrifying acts of terrorism and brutality. And we have to look at education as one of the primary ways in which we can prevent humanity from sinking to such a low and horrific place. And so that's how we're going to begin this discussion this morning. So in the book called Ensaan and Kamil, The Perfect Man by Ayatollah Mutahari, we see that he highlights that we do have a real and objective role model, a living model for the guidelines of this Deen al-Haq, this religion of truth. It's not just an idealism, but it's a real possibility, and it's something we should all be striving for. This religion can bring the perfection of the human being, can elevate us, can enlighten us. And we really have to wonder if we're really putting this religion into practice when we see all the difficulties that we face as a Muslim community. Some of us can barely get our messages organized to have regular programming, right? Some of us can barely have access to the mosque itself, where we can understand the religion. Some of us can barely have access to meaningful Quranic information and other religious information. So how is it that we're going to put this religion into practice when we have so many shortcomings? Well, one of them is to begin with developing our educational model. The Holy Prophet being our first example, and his twin being Imam Ali alayhi salam, are our prime examples. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, the one who wants to live my life and die my death will attach himself to Ali alayhi salam. Allahumma salli The Prophet ﷺ also said that Ali alayhi salam stands in relation to me as my head to my body. Mutahari points out that a Shia, a Shia means someone who accompanies Ali, not only with words and sentiments, but with the act of following him in practice, and in act in philosophical and academic terms as well. So we look at this notion of a perfect human being, not just horizontally complete, meaning a well-rounded individual, but we're also talking about a vertical ascension in terms of levels of perfection religiously and spiritually, really in a Gnostic sense. So we're not talking about perfection of the human being as a material or physical form, but in spirit. And this is the part I want to emphasize today in all my lectures. In education today, we are so concerned about the outward achievement of these individual students, but there's no question about their inward development as spiritual beings. This is what we're talking about when we talk about complete human being or perfect human being, this inward development, this inward knowing. And all of you know the story of Imam Sajjad at the Hajj and how there were many people circumambulating, and his companion was so impressed with the numbers of people who were there, right? Outwardly, it looked wonderful. But yet, when he looked through the fingers of the Imam, he saw that the majority of them looked just like animals. They weren't even like humans. And it's this inward knowing that this story is reminding us that we must be paying attention to. So we're not, as Muslims, to be outwardly concerned only with materialism, with this appearance-oriented world. And in this day and age, we are just bombarded with outward stimuli, excessive stimuli. You have screens everywhere, right? You can't go to the library or even to the airport anymore without there being screens all around you. So there's constant stimulation. And then we've got so much worldly emphasis on how we look. Our assessment of our worth is constantly a human experience, to be concerned about status and wealth and position and any outward aspects of the human being. But let's look at these ayahs that I pointed out in the beginning of my lecture. When we look at these verbs, zakkaha and dasaha, if you notice, those are Form 2 verbs for any of you who know Arabic. Form 2 verbs are causative or intensive verbs. There's a strength with these verbs. There's an action happening with these verbs. So when we look here, قَدْ أَفْلَهَ مَنْ زَكَاهَا, successful here, أَفْلَهَ, coming from the root فَلَهَا. There's a beauty to this word, and if we don't go to the root of it, you'll only think of this word in the mundane way that you're used to. But to be truly successful has to do with tilling the earth or cleaving the soil. That's what this root word means, falaha, to cleave the soil. What does that mean? You're breaking up something that is hard and solid and something that has before been impenetrable. You have to be in that process. So success is synonymous with doing the work of tilling the soil of the soul. And successful are the ones who purify the soul. Zakat, the root of that also means to grow, to prosper, and with the element. So you see, we can't sit on the surface of the human entity, on this physical self, to be successful. We have to penetrate through this soil, breaking those hard clumps of stubborn earth, to ready this soul for spiritual success. And these are the types of questions that parents don't ask when they go to school, when they ask, what is your school all about? Are you going to penetrate the heart of my student? Are you going to cultivate the soul of this spiritual being? Isn't it amazing that we have Muslim schools, but these questions are not even asked or even considered? So let's get comfortable and clear about this non-physical element of the human being. Mutahari in this book, The Perfect Human, goes on to say that these non-physical elements are what may be called the intellectual. And these are the things which give the human her value and personality. If she's deprived of them, she will sink to the level of animals. And Sa'di, the poet, famous Persian poet, has expressed this idea beautifully. And this is the poem. A human's body is ennobled by her soul, and this fine garment is not a sign of humanity. If a human were known by her eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, what difference would there be between a picture on the wall and humanity? What difference would there be between a picture on the wall and humanity if we were only known by this physical self? So to start talking about the development of the Ensaan and Kamil, our communities must start asking, their first and foremost concern should be, how can I nourish the soul of my child, the humanity of my child? And when you answer this question and you have an educational system that has this at the heart, then these other topics we're talking about, engaging civilly with the wider community, it will definitely happen. When you talk about the role of the youth coming up in a healthy way, it will definitely happen. When you talk about issues of terrorism and violence, that will be overcome because the soul of the human being has been developed correctly. Now Mutahari says, a child grows up and is sound in all his organs and limbs, and these develop harmoniously. But if he grows up cartoon-like, some parts of whom develop to excess and others not growing at all, then this may result in imperfection or insufficiency, not growing healthily, and he cannot attain perfection. But a harmonious and well-rounded development may result in a perfect human being. A human being, he should develop every aspect of himself or herself harmoniously. So, what does this mean? This means on a practical level that we don't indulge our children excessively with material goods, with favors, with special treatment. This means also on the counter side that we don't indulge in excessive acts of worship that do not constitute harmonious development towards perfection, right? So our religion is about balance. So everything has to have its right place and right balance. So he notes, no one who is an absolute devotee or ascetic or a freeborn person or someone in love or intelligent. He says, do these make someone who is perfect? No. But if all of these values are developed in a human in a harmonious way, then she or he may be considered perfect. Imam Ali alayhi salam was such a human. Now he notes, Mutahari notes and criticizes that during a certain period of the history of Iran, there was an overemphasis on asceticism and Gnosticism that was the trend amongst the ulama for many years. He criticizes this and he says they were neglecting the true message of Imam Ali alayhi salam regarding social justice, political reformation, and all the other domains of human experience. So our religion is not just about acts of worship and devotion or events at the mosque, but it has to be complete. So we also see from Sayyid Razi, who's the compiler of the Nahj al-Balagha, when he talks about the character of Imam Ali, he says, the amazing thing about this book, when you read it, is that you see that Ali is in so many different worlds. He's in the worlds of devotion, philosophy, mysticism, military affairs, courts of justice, human relations, religious jurisprudence, and so on. He's never absent from any human world. And that's what a perfect human being is. Someone who's interested in all aspects of life and can address all these areas. Now, likewise, today, our communities are very one-dimensional when it comes to the education of the child. The individual externally evaluated achievement of one's child is considered the priority. People want to know, how is my child doing? How is my child advancing in this class? Are you giving my child more homework? Can you push my child ahead in this grade, and so forth? And there's never a question of the ummah. How is our class doing? How is our school doing? Are we getting all of these children to be moving ahead in healthy and positive ways? Now last year I had the opportunity to speak about rhythm in education at Ummah, and I discussed a model that has a healthier approach to education without sacrificing the emotional well-being of the child. And I talked to you about PISA, or the Program for International Student Assessment, which is run by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. And in the past couple of years, in 2003, 2006, and 2009, the top performers who were ranked high in this system of ranking were Finland and South Korea. And if you had the opportunity to hear this lecture, we found out that South Korea, while they may rank high in academic achievement, have the highest rates of youth suicide in the world. The highest rates. While Finland, on the other hand, follows a model which is much more balanced and healthy and had certain components that are very similar to the system of education that I'm going to tell you a little bit about today, which is Waldorf education, which I am trained in. It's a system of education that understands the holistic being of the human and understands how to educate them in a balanced and systematically healthy, developmentally appropriate way. So that's what we talked about last year. Now the question this year is, what are the origins of the public school model, the Western education model, and do they match the needs of the Muslims? Now given that our goal is to develop a whole human being, and this is in the model of our Holy Prophet and Imam Ali alayhi salam, this is the question today. Do we have a system that addresses this need? What is our needs and what are the needs of the public education model? Now, if any of you have followed the issue of public education reformation or any kinds of initiatives to help better the public school model, you'll find that many critics and reformers will willingly acknowledge that the institution itself of public schooling needs a complete overhaul, and that the system is so monolithic that it is pretty impenetrable to meaningful change. So many times money or new technological gadgets are offered as a solution to address the poor test scores or the dropout rates or other ills that are within the school system. And today we have a whole other issue with school public education, and that is safety. So we see that there are tremendous issues that are trying to be overcome, but often they're trying to be met through either technological advancements or some new initiative or money. But these will never really reform a system that itself has been started with different purposes. Now, John Taylor Gatto, in his book, The Underground History of American Education, describes compulsory or forced public education. Notice the words I'm using. Forced public education as the brainchild of America's early industrialists. And it was designed to educate the masses to become workers to fuel the growth of industry. Now, he notes this is a very interesting concept because if you understand the history of the beginning of the United States and the very independent, pragmatic spirit that was within this country when it was first founded, you'll find that there was great resistance to forced schooling. And notice the word I'm using again. He says that the removal of children from their parents to be given to a so-called group of experts to be trained to become useful citizens and workers was at first completely opposed by early Americans. They, for example, in the state of Massachusetts in the 1850s, had to have the militia be brought in to escort these students to public school. The people resisted it. They didn't want mandatory schooling. 80% of the early residents of Massachusetts resisted forced schooling. He says by 1917 that the major administrative jobs of the American public school system were controlled by something called the Education Trust. The Education Trust. Now this was filled with representatives from Rockefeller, Carnegie, Harvard, Stanford, the University of Chicago, and the NEA. And their main goal was imposing the ideal of subordination or making the masses dependent. Now this dependency is something we can see today because we have something that's called prolonged or extended childhood. Now many of you know that very few undergraduate degrees actually lead to real jobs. Many undergraduate degrees have to be followed up with graduate degrees. And then we still have a big number of graduates coming back home in their 30s because they have been unable to find a job. So we see this extended period of adolescence and dependency, still to this day. Now there's a historian by the name of Michael Katz, and he says, the crusade for educational reform led by Horace Mann, and this is in the early periods of developing public education, was not the simple, unambiguous good it had long been taken to be, but the central aim of the movement was to establish more efficient mechanisms of social control, and its chief legacy was the principle that education was something the better part of the community did to the others to make them orderly, moral, and tractable. Now, Gatto, in his book, goes on to very scathingly note, he says, listen to this, suppose that producing incomplete beings is the purpose of modern schooling. Suppose that producing incomplete beings is the purpose of modern schooling. And what was our goal today? To talk about complete or perfect human beings, balanced human beings who have every dimension of their being, their soul, their spirit, their heart, their mind, their hands, actively engaged and educated. That's what we're after. But he's saying, suppose this whole system that we're trying to emulate, suppose that its real purpose is not to do that. He says, further, suppose there is a rational defense for doing it. He says, suppose a century ago, far-sighted men and women, although they were largely men, say that to realize the potential in machinery and fossil fuel, that the bulk of the population would have to be dumbed down and made dependent. But because in this fashion, they could become a population of producers, which surely characterizes the American scene then, and be turned into the consumers required by a commercially intense economy today. Isn't that true? We have such an intense focus on consumerism these days. Now, Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller alone, these are two independent industrialists, spent more money than the government did between 1900 and 1920 on engineering the educational system. These two men spent more money than the United States government on engineering the public education system. And yet we as Muslims, especially those coming from other countries, we come here and what do? We want to have the best in this system, and we don't even question where this system arose and whether it matches our values as Muslims. Because we're so concerned with financial well-being and security that we've overlooked these important questions. Now, you think these are great philanthropists. They've donated all this money. They've done this work. Well, mass schooling was originally designed to become a tool of social control. Now, here is a quote directly from John D. Rockefeller's General Education Board. He says, "In our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present education conventions of intellectual and character education fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into men of learning or philosophers or men of science. We have not to raise up from them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters, great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, statesmen, politicians, creatures of whom we have ample supply. The task is simple. We will organize children and teach them in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way." These are the words of John D. Rockefeller from the General Education Board. Now, the final question is, why do we as Muslims, with our own set of values and priorities, take on this model unquestioningly, randomly insert Quran studies, halal food, a dress code, and call it an Islamic school? You're taking a model you haven't even dissected and looked at with any critical thought, and you insert what you think makes it Islamic and then call it a Muslim school. How can that be? This is an absurd notion, in fact. So we need to rethink our priorities and our own vision, and we should create a healthy system that doesn't indoctrinate students with dogma or a narrow point of view of the world. But we should think about how we can give these children a human experience where the heart, the head, and the hands of the child are developed equally. So the question too is, does a model like this already exist, whereby the soul of the child, along with his or her mind and heart and will, can be educated holistically? Does this already exist? In fact, it does. The Waldorf educational model is a pedagogy that does provide for the development of a complete human being, a balanced human being, an Ensaan et Kamil. So in the book, Understanding Waldorf Education, Teaching from the Inside Out, Jack Petrash, who is a master Waldorf teacher and is also my teacher, he notes, Waldorf schools serve as advocates for children by offering an educational program that promotes well-rounded development, where children are prepared for life, not just future employment. He goes on to emphasize that the true educational values, the child's inner experience, and Waldorf provides a system whereby students bring heartfelt interest to their studies and knowledge comes alive. And another very key component about Waldorf education is that the teacher is looked at as the key component to the teaching, the being of the teacher. And I have some of my Sunday school trainees who I've worked with on this topic. The being of the teacher is what teaches. The spiritual development of the teacher is a key component to Waldorf education. And we as Muslims never even ask this question either. Are we looking at these teachers we're employing as spiritual models? Where are they in their spiritual progression and development? Are we supporting them in their development of their higher consciousness so that they can be literally lifting the children up by their very being, by their very example? And this is not even asked. This is such a key component to the Waldorf system. In fact, most of the teacher training in Waldorf education is all about the self-development of the teacher. So we see that this is a system that has a lot of what we value. And we find that when the students learn in this environment, they're not just learning through the head, but they're connecting through the heart. Their feelings are engaged. Their emotions and their ability to sense things is engaged. And this creates what's called an idealistic and vital living thinking capacity. And this is creative thinking that is warm and attends to the interests and the needs of society. And this is what's missing in the public school model. This warmth of interest and investment, this inward drawing towards the subject matter, which will engage the human being in a complete way. And when you know this feeling, because when you study something you love, when you hear something that is so engaging, your whole being goes towards it. And we need to educate teachers to be prepared to create learning environments where this is a common practice and a common experience. So I want to mention to you about the Islamic Golden Age, because while we talk here in these conferences and we present these wonderful notions and we inspire the audience to think about ways they can take this information back home and make things happen and make things change, that we have to talk about how does this actually work. In the Islamic Golden Age, there was many scholars who flourished in every field of study. All the sciences, all the literature, all manner of translation of the Greek texts and so forth, astronomy, mathematics, all variations of the sciences and so forth. The reason why that they were able to flourish and develop this knowledge to such an extent is because they were supported and patronized by the ruling the Khalifas and the ruling sultanates of the age and of the big Islamic empire. They began to compete with one another in their support of these scholars and in support of these people who were studying. And they would say, I've got the best scholar. There were even cases where they would steal a scholar from a different sultanate and bring them to their court so that they can say, we have this a major mind and he's working in our area or she's working in our area. So nonetheless, why do we not have this within our communities today? Wouldn't it be amazing if each of our masjids, each of our centers began to compete with one another by supporting different people who have initiatives within education, within other fields. And they say, we've got these scholars and we're supporting them, we're patronizing them, and we're helping them develop these new models to meet the needs of our community. So, inshallah, I'm beginning the process of designing the first Muslim Waldorf school this summer. And I'm beginning to establish working plans to create this new model, to meet the needs of our students in a holistic and meaningful way where the spirit and the soul of the child is the primary concern of the educators, where we can really develop true Muslims whose religion will heal their souls so that we can heal not only the individual but the society at large from the ills that we face. So I invite you to join me in this new paradigm, this new process and this new project by becoming one of those sponsors in developing this new model. With that, I'd say thank you for your time and attention, and I wish you all a very wonderful weekend where you are inspired and filled with the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the spirit of the Ahlul Bayt. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.